Carlos Ramos foi o grande mentor. Professora docente desta escola, é um dos elementos fundamentais também deste ensino, deste modo de ver e de fazer arquitetura tão genuíno, tão português.
Eu sou uma pessoa de background para criar o fundo das vidas dos outros, das vidas das pessoas. O background está por trás e as figuras estão à frente. Eu, aos 10 anos, decidi que ia ser arquiteta. Não havia nenhum arquiteto na Guarda, não conhecíamos arquitetos. E eu alimentei essa ideia depois e nunca hesitei.
E foi precisamente aqui, na Faculdade de Arquitetura, que Teresa Fonseca desenvolveu todo o seu potencial teórico e prático. O desenho tem uma direção, o desenho importa e é um elemento fundamental para desenvolver não só as ideias, mas construir cidade, que de algum modo vai caracterizar todo o trabalho futuro ao nível da habitação de Teresa Fonseca.
Tenho muito carinho pelo Instituto da Água, porque acho que fizemos um espaço de arte, que até os frascos laboratoriais estão nos corredores com vidros que se abrem, os frasquinhos todos, de toda a espécie, que eu achei aquilo lindíssimo.
Estamos aqui no IAREN, em Matosinhos, uma obra projetada pela arquiteta Teresa Fonseca e é uma obra distinta. Como podemos ver, a sua materialidade é completamente produzida, construída em betão. Aqui, particularmente neste edifício, o que revela é uma grande maturidade em termos de desenho, de domínio do programa, da relação também que estabelece com este sítio, criando, por vezes, situações do inesperado, que é o caso desta rampa, que aqui aparece quase uma visão muito brasileira, se quisermos. Lembra aqui Niemeyer, há uma certa ideia de junção de mundos, junção de patrimónios intelectuais e culturais que, naturalmente, a arquitetura pode oferecer.
Boa noite.
Good evening and welcome to Casa da Arquitetura, to the last debate, the parallel program of the exhibition Read Our Venice, Portuguese Architects in the Biennale 75 to 2021. To debate selection, we have architects Léa-Catherine, Szacka, and Paula Santos, and the co-curator of the exhibition, Joaquim Moreno. Hello, good evening. Thank you for coming. Is this working? Technology? Can you hear me? Okay. Let me thank, more than just presenting, the format that we have been trying to define, that it's not fully complete, is to have an institutional voice, a professional voice, and an historical one, and critical also. Well, we don't have an institutional voice. We have a wonderful voice of practice of the architect Paula Santos, not just an architect of acknowledged professional merit. She also has been working in, how to put this, she has been trying to increase the contact of surface of architecture with the rest of the society in events such as open house and a continuous activity within the Bar of Architects. in terms of the point of view of history. Leah, is the translation working? Is it? Thank you, thank you. So she writes for the book, and if I were to tell you the origin of this invitation, I think that we can easily understand the relevance of the work of Leah on the greater debate on the Biennale. Recently, she put together a book called Geographies, Conversations on the Itinerary Exhibitions. This is more or less a free translation because it's a little hard, tells us the moderator. She interviewed a set of characters, of documenta, of a set of cultural events that, coming from the Biennale model, have different variations in time and structure. So they have a greater vision of this field, on how it happens, on how people are selected, on the curators, on how to nurture it from the economical point of view. The reason in this exhibition, the Portuguese Architects and the Biennale, this campus, Encounter Campus, had a classic blind spot. The Biennale of 1980, the famous Biennale, the Prince of the Past, with the curatorship of architect Paula Portuguese, a gentleman called Paulo Português. If you were to see that in the exhibition, the 1980 is just a contour. We could not find any Portuguese architect, so you will just find an empty spot. No Portuguese architects at that Biennale. So bringing the speech around this constructions of the Biennale with Portuguese architecture had this kind of void, haunted void, if you will. And Leah published a book, an award-winning book, from a doctorate thesis, which means to exhibit the postmodern, the Biennale of Venice 1980. It is exactly and probably the most thorough and extensive work of analysis of said Biennale. That's why we decided that, on behalf of a wise view of history, we asked for an essay to fight that void even more, because she was able to detour to bring us an amazing perspective of Portuguese architects in 1976. This seems to be reason enough for one to be courteous in bringing her to watch the exhibition that she was a part of, actually, and then to summon you and to have a very pivotal voice in this kind of debates. So our debate today, and not having an institutional voice, an institutional character, maybe we have some leeway because we might have an opinion. We don't need to have the responsibility and the reasonability of someone who has to show some power. So we showed and left for the end these models of selection. Those models have changed. Usually there is a model of a competition limited to invitations with 2 juries. That is the ongoing model in Portugal. There is a jury, panel of juries nominating guests, and then there is another one who assesses the proposals by guests. Clearly, this model brought forward 2 Biennale 018, and what's missing from this exhibition, that is now closing in Venice, the Biennale of 2021. This model brings with it a set of questions. Those who were here in the last debate, those who were in the first, were able to understand that Biennale of São Paulo does not have any kind of representation. Biennale at São Paulo has the support of the Portuguese state, a manifestation of interest, and then a support so that the curators can visit the Portuguese artists. It's a consulate of influence, a direct support to the non-assumption of a choosing, of a choice. And as we could see in the previous debate via Veneza, that the Biennale of São Paulo for the general curatorship is a competition per se. So there is all these other issues that come about if in fact it should be an open tender, it should be a tender by invitation, should it be paid, should it be in different stages, it's a tender for Portuguese curators, is it an open tender, an open competition? And Léa, she has been going through these issues, she has been thinking about this, so she's here to give us a critical view to open our debate. One other, for those who were at the visit that we did with DEPA, which are the curators of this last Biennale, who are concerned on how to produce memory. This is kind of a memory, a collective elaboration on the memory of these things. But now we have the exhibition, they had the key responsibility at their hand. They took on the production of the exhibition that they had won in tender, and their job is to exhibit in Venice. Okay, so it's not in their contract to produce memory, to produce archive, transport, or national visibility. With other functional structures, this happened nonetheless. When we talk about selection, we must talk about memory. We must talk about an eventual return. If someone remembers the session that preceded this one, Jean-Louis Cohen said that we don't have a memory because we summon a set of images to assemble a film in Venice in the French representation, but the rights that we had was to collect them to the Biennale. So, no rights. We don't have legally the Biennale cuts of the film. There was an intangible connection to it, because in terms of what's tangible, we were not concerned. I do remember that in 08 we were all quite alleviated when the counterweights were separated. The iron for the structures was recovered by the contractor because at that time there was scarcity. The mirrors had mechanical fixations they were not damaged, so they were all returned, and somewhat things gather and have the minimum footprint as possible. So this is the universe of debate that I would love to open to our dear guests. I think that Léa can firstly tell us about the landscape, the general landscape, about everything that I said. You have the floor. Thank you.
So I heard a translation of what Joaquim is saying. So first of all, I would like to thank very much Joaquim and Casa Arquitetura, for this invitation, especially as Joaquim said, because it's great to be able to to see the exhibition, which I think is terrific. I've seen obviously the book before, which is also great, but it was very nice to see it in 3 dimensions in here and to visit this space for the first time. So I will just throw a few things for the discussion, I guess. The first one is that I would like to actually propose, let's say, 3 lines of thoughts for the discussion, 3 themes that I think are important in this question of the selection of national representation for the Biennale. So the three themes are, I'm just going to throw them first and then go back to explain. So the first one is the question of institution or institutionalization of the Biennale. The second one is the transparency, the question of transparency, and I think that was already mentioned in the last, so I listened to the discussion with Jean-Louis Cohen and Vanessa Grossman. And the third one is the geopolitics or the geopolitical aspect of this selection and of the Biennale. So the first one, institutions, obviously the selection for National Pavilion, and I think there is different models in different countries, and we can discuss that. I don't know of all the countries, but I have a knowledge or an experience of some different ways of selecting, and it's always to do with institutions. So the question would be what should be the role of institutions in this selection? Which institution should be involved? Is it national institution? Is it local? Should it be always the same institution, or should it rotate? For example, in my country, I come from Canada, and there's also, obviously, it's a very large country with very different realities from the east to the west, and also with 2 very different cultures. So there's always a question of, do you have to be representative of the 2 sides? So this kind of question, so regional, national institution, and finally how to institutionalize this national representation. So what is the institutional strategy behind this selection and the kind of continuity from year to year? So this is the first aspect I think that we can discuss. The second one, as I said, is transparency. Obviously, it's a very important aspect when we talk about selection, and I think especially nowadays with a lot of revendication that are coming up, but should it be an open competition? Like, for example, in Germany, Switzerland, or Canada, I think the process is very much transparent. We know the jury, we know the selection, it's an open competition. Julia Albani, in her text or in her interview in the text, she mentions that when she came from more of a German-Swiss background and she came to Portugal, she was also shocked by the kind of difference that they were here. So is the selection upon invitation? For example, I know that in Italy it's a 2-stage process in which I think it's a bit similar to here, where a few teams are invited to submit a project, but it's very little transparent in the sense that no one knows. You only know who won, but you don't know who were the teams involved. You don't know who's the jury, so there's really a lack of transparency here. Of course, there is a lot of politics involved in this lack of transparency or transparency. So who is taking those decisions? Is in some cases it's or it has been, or it is simply a political nomination. So also, as it was mentioned, and I think that's quite important, I think it was mentioned in the last debate, the difference between the selection for art and for architecture, because obviously with architecture, in terms of transparency, there is this belief that architecture is much more a public art, a collective art, so it should be really even more perhaps transparent. So the question is more complex in the case of architecture than it is for visual art perhaps. And there is also an issue of representation, because do you have to I think in the art biennale, it's a little bit more accepted or a little bit more a given that it should be one person, like one artist is representing the, and in architecture, should it be a kind of representative selection of a series of people that represent what the architecture of the country is, or should it, or can it be just a single sort of artist, architect represented? And then in terms of representation and transparency, obviously there is questions of diversity and of gender balance and diversity representation. And then finally, the third point was the geopolitical aspect. So the Venice Biennale, I'm sure everybody knows the way at least the Giardini in Venice works. So since 1991, architecture was presented in the Giardini in the National Pavilion, and then there are a lot of pavilions that are either in the Arsenale or spread across Venice. But in the Giardini, at least there is a very strong geopolitics. So the Biennale is really a stage, and the countries that have their pavilion in the Giardini are a certain number. I think it's 26. You cannot, as I think Portugal knows very well, you cannot extend that because, as I understood, there was a project to build a Portuguese pavilion and it didn't materialize. So this number is closed, and the other countries that are more and more every year just have to find other spaces. But of course, it's much more important if you're in the Giardini. So there's a question of, which countries are represented there, and it's a very sort of 19th century or beginning of 20th century geopolitics. Like, for example, China doesn't have a pavilion in the Giardini, which, if we think of the importance of countries nowadays, would be unthinkable. So who is represented in the Giardini? If you're not, where are you? How to make your voice or how to make your country kind of stand out? And then how do you want to, what kind of image of the country you want to project? What kind of narrative you want to create? And there is obviously super important in the Biennale, the kind of local global dichotomy. So Venice is a very local place in a sense, and I think Joaquim also lived in Venice and knows very well this kind of very strange. I think Venice is a city like no other, where it's super local and at the same time extremely global. And so the Venice Biennale and the national representation is really kind of stuck in this kind of local global dichotomy or opposition, I would say. And then there is also the link with the city. So this is more in terms of geopolitics and where the pavilions are placed. It's much more also linked to the wider question of the role of, and then that's where I come back to this other work that I did on Biennale and Triennale of architecture and the role they have for the host city. So how the presence of these national representation in the city of Venice is playing. So I think those are the three aspects I would like to discuss. So institutions, transparency, and geopolitics. And finally, I think it's quite interesting to see this research now because as Joaquim mentioned, when I started this research on the history of the Architecture Biennale in already about 15 years ago, there was very little, and now this kind of grand history of the Venice Architecture Biennale is sort of written, and I think the Venice Biennale just published a book also about that. So now it's the sort of second phase of the historicization of the Biennale, where people start to write more particular history. So here we have the history of the Portuguese representation at the Biennale. There was a wonderful book that was done by a Norwegian group about the history of the Nordic Pavilion, which is a fantastic building in Venice. A lot of PhDs, so I see a lot of young scholars that are now doing, more specific research on their country or on a specific aspect of the architecture biennale. So I think this exhibition and this book is really part of this second stage of research on the history of the architecture biennale. So I will stop here for now. Maybe we can, I don't know, we will continue in Portuguese or, yeah.
Ok. Bom, então, boa noite a todos.
Good evening. Let me also thank Casa da Arquitetura and Joaquim Moreno for having me, for being here today. Let me take advantage of this opportunity to congratulate Casa da Arquitetura for its 4th birthday. And I was thinking, how was it possible to do so many things in 4 years, bringing architects to so many celebrations, so much representation, and at the same time, a lot of events. Because Casa da Arquitetura has been doing an amazing work, maybe a unique work in our country. Like Joaquim said, I'm here as an architect who observes participating in a small component. On an art biennale, I was co-operator of João Pedro Croft in his participation. And I've gone sometimes, starting in 1995 when I started to have an attendance at the Biennale. I would start by talking about not institutionalization. I believe that that is something, how to put this, it's a very open subject. It brings a lot of opinions, a lot of debate. Let me start by talking about 2 things. First, space, where we have the presentation and representation of each country, and then the issue of what should be the representation or how it should happen between the binomium of construction and information. There has been a lot of experiences throughout the years, namely in our Portuguese representation, between the construction and information binomium. And this is something that we must think about. This issue of space, it is clear that when we go to the Biennale of Venice, what causes a greater effect in the sense of the memory that we have of representation, most of it is the space that is built. The national representation of countries who have the right to have a pavilion at Giardini usually have a greater capacity of presentation. They have a privileged defined area, buildings with quality, and they know from the start where they will exhibit, how they will exhibit, and it's almost as being an exhibition at a museum. Figuratively, of course, but the museum is always architecture, author architecture, improving representation, but we don't have that. We never did. We had some opportunities, starting with Álvaro Siza. The last one was in 2016, when we were thinking about the Plaza Judaica and putting the pavilion there. That was a possibility for which I confirmed in his interview, he was not that convinced because he thought that Judaica was quite lateral when seen in the bigger picture of the city. But the Portuguese representation was always in some areas that were rented throughout the years, and I would say with the money that we spent renting spaces, we could have built a pavilion of greater importance. Maybe no one thought of this seriously. Our representation, the ones that from my point of view have a greater effect, are the ones that build. Namely, the first one that I saw creating a true emotion was Eduardo Souto Mouras with Ângelo Sousa And it was important because of two things. First, because it was a Portuguese artist and an architect. They both worked together, but they interpreted the scenography and the theater, the atmosphere that Venice conveys. And so there was a great symbiosis between the architect and the artist, and the designers, the builders. But this issue of the mirroring, that theater view, was properly drafted, and it was very interesting in its result beyond all the underlying communication to the way that the subject was designed, etc. That was quite interesting. And I also found it interesting the attempt of curators Nuno Grande and Roberto Cremascoli trying via architecture and Portuguese representation to recover a project that was abandoned, trying that the Portuguese representation would be stated on the building or the finishing of a construction of a neighborhood that Caesar started a few years ago. It was a failed attempt, but it was worth it because it arised some debate on the way that construction in Venice happens. It's really, really tricky. I was able to follow this curatorship because I followed the films, the director, I went to Berlin, I went to Porto, I was in Geoteca, following in the filming, and it was quite an interesting attempt, building the square, the plaza, and finishing the building. So it was an attempt that was genuine, objective, so that the Portuguese representation could have a meaning to it, a moment of permanence of the Portuguese architecture in Venice that was never finished, and I don't know if it ever will. At the same time, we also did an attempt of designing the square with an intervention of artists, which Pedro Croft ended up not becoming a reality, and we did it the building next door, next to the canal, which is almost similar to what we have here at Casa Arquitetura, which is the way that the city of Matosinhos decided to buy a piece of art or a work of art for the Casa Arquitetura, but it was a financial and diplomatic view of this participation of José Pedro Croft. The other Portuguese representations in different areas, palaces, with exhibitions that were, I would say, more traditional, where they selected a list of production of national architecture, where in the last few years are about subjects such as the house or some subjects like this last one, which is the neighborhoods or social housing and the participation of people in the neighborhood, the conflict that comes about, which is something very different, informative, the issue about construction, about training, which is much harder to read for those who visit, namely for other people, not just Portuguese people. Portuguese people can clearly understand the message, but many times, if things are not objective, it becomes hard to read for visitors. So building is an option, and it's an option with different Portuguese participations. Aires Mateus, Souto Moura, the Pavilion of the Vatican, built an amazing chapel. There have been interventions of Portuguese architects building in the territory of the city, and that is always very interesting. And I think this creates a mechanism of reflection, not reflection, but how to put this, the identity for Portuguese architects when they go to an intervention or a work of a Portuguese architect in that territory, which is quite theatrical. I think it was Gregotti who said that exhibitions should not be informative because people don't want to go to the Biennale to get informed. And indeed, in the exhibition of Arsenal, where most representations or the exhibition is informative, in the middle of it, we are confused, we are tired of so many information. Many times the information of what is being done, if it's not clear, if it's not, I would say, almost objective, elementary in its message, makes it difficult that that representation is powerful or becomes powerful in terms of choosing. And I hereby finish. An institutionalization, of course. We have been working with DG Arts, which is a representation, an institution of the Ministry of Culture, has always been a very fragile institution with changes, with moves in terms of leadership. But this hypothesis of holding a tender, I agree. I think that's one of the ways to go, to have a tender, a competition. Maybe we should debate on how. That's what I wanted to debate with you, how to put together this tender. Because this competition, this tender, opens different readings from the state of Portuguese architecture, because there are different types of representation. Building is a thing that's direct, updated at the moment. It's contemporary architecture, but when we're talking about information, it might be the history of a process, a device, a reading of architect a long time. So it becomes a bit different, and one and the other are valid. Anyway, that tender is very interesting because it opens different possibilities of participating as a country in something that's universal. So getting a different presence. And I would love to hear your opinion and also the opinion of Léa-Catherine, because I am more or less within the way that institutions manage these things. I would love to get your take on it so that we can debate about it. And I will rest here. Thank you. Clearly, I have a committed position with the curator of the Portuguese representation. It was direct choice. It was my nomination of DG Arts. At that time, I thought it was the right thing to do, but it was legitimate on trying to define what would happen. But I thought it was an amazing opportunity because I didn't know José Gil, and José Gil obviously didn't know me. So someone cooked this special blind date, if you will, a fixed marriage, and a fixed marriage that, unlike many other marriages out of love, went wonderfully. And it was an amazing process of discovery. And I thought that the only reason for this choice, which is completely arbitrary, would be the sortilege of discovery, of the research that was brought forward. I never felt that I had to explain anything. Anyway, I fully agree with the tender. But in the catalog, the text of the book has a presentation about something that it's quite Venetian, which is Venice had an amazing system and very complex to choose the electors. Venice had a republican model in its classical sense, and their definition was a pool of aristocratic voters. So citizenship was at that time a privilege, but within that privilege there was an extraordinary idea. It's always a bad idea to give power to those who want it, which is, well, after studying all of this, I was quite flabbergasted, and it seemed important, this logic of this pool. For 1,000 years they did this in Venice until the invasions of Napoleon came about, and it was the end of the Republic of Venice. Well, it was a set of pools of nominations and drawing to give some random spirit to the voters who would select the Dodge. It was the set of voters that was randomized, so there is no way of lobbying. There was no way of betting on a certain candidate. And even if the Dodge was not someone who was poor, only the aristocrats could be selected. It would have to be a remarkable character. There is no hegemony. So it was a lifelong selection, so there needed to be some rotation to it. This process disappeared in full. We only use it as a paradox in justice because we think that the best way to have representativity at a jury of a court is by drawing. Or to have, for example, a neighborhood representation when the citizenship needs to be exempt, functional. We persist on this type of systems, and honestly I should say that sometimes I ask myself, why not a tender? Sure, but instead of nominating a jury that will then nominate curators and then to nominate a different jury to choose the proposal, and then probably the Court of Audits will name someone else, and it's a kind of a committee with another committee wrapped around another committee. So why don't we all think about the pool of voters? And we can do this in a random manner and define who chooses. Everyone is free to bring whatever they want forward, and we try to get this representativity of those who choose and do it the other way around. For example, text of the book has this sense which is a bit cheeky and it's a bit tricky even. But it's a Byzantine and Venetian proposal, but comes from a Republican heritage. It seems to me that this is very important, but thinking collectively how this tender could go on. This is my delirious contribution, Léa.
Okay, so just to go back to what Paula was saying, I think that the example of 2018, right, is indeed very interesting because of the impact it had, or because of, you know, obviously it's also, had a pervasive impact on architecture, not just, as you say, this difference between building and information. So it's not just information, and that obviously was linked to the history of the Venice Biennale, as we see in the exhibition, with the years of Gregotti, when there was the idea of salvaging some buildings in Venice, the Mulino Stucchi, etc. So it was really connected to these first experience, or this kind of prehistory of the Venice Architecture Biennale. So I think that was a very important aspect. Also the idea of theatricality that I think you mentioned, but also also Joaquim in his text on Venice and on this city that is probably the most theatrical in the world. So it's very important that the representation or the national representation has this theatrical aspect. And I always think about, because the other point that we didn't mention, but obviously, especially in the case of the Venice Biennale, is there's a huge problem of size, because it's just a bombardment of information when we go to Venice. I think we all had this this impression when we go to visit the Biennale that, you know, it's so much to take on. So it's very difficult, especially for the National Pavilion, especially if you're not in the Giardini, to kind of stand out and make an impression on people. So I remember once I actually did a small exhibition at the Biennale a few years ago, and someone told me, and I think it was a really good advice, that at the Biennale there's a rule of sort of there's like multiple temporality or multiple ways of reading an exhibition, and that a successful participation should have three temporalities. So one is, I think it was 3 seconds, 3 minutes, and 30 minutes. So an exhibition should be able to be something that if you go and you just enter and go out in 3 seconds, you have something that is quite powerful and that you will remember. That if you want to, that you can read the same exhibition in 3 minutes, meaning just taking a little bit of time for a sort of superficial reading, and then that there should be a third level, which is for someone who wants to, and we all know that it will be very, very few people that will spend 30 minutes in a National Pavilion. So that a good exhibition should be able to be read at those 3 levels. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say is in terms of the competition and the choice, I think I totally agree that a competition that is as transparent as possible would be good. But I think the question is also, and I don't necessarily have the answer, but maybe it's something we can talk about, is what this national representation should actually do. Like, so should it be and that comes back also to the question of who can curate a pavilion, because I think I mentioned, we had discussion before, that some pavilions don't even require that the curator comes from the country. So, you know, in order to represent Portuguese architecture, do you need to be Portuguese, or could it be also an international curator that has a kind of outside gaze on the production of the country? So what is it, like, is this exhibition supposed to be representative, or should it be a reflection on the contemporary world that comes from Portugal but maybe looks at the world in general, or should it be productive? So, for example, you know, it could be that you ask a series of Portuguese architects to produce a piece just for the exhibition. So, in that case, the exhibition really serves as something that stimulates creation rather than represents something that is built. So I think the selection depends also of what one wants to do with this exhibition, what one thinks that this national representation should be, and the aspect of impact. I think what you mentioned with the project of Cisa and Rossi is, you know, if we think that, do we think that this national representation should have a long-lasting impact on the city of Venice or on architecture in Portugal? So all these questions enter, I think, in this selection, and it really depends what we want to do with this representation. There was also I just want to mention it because I thought it was I was in a similar panel for the midissage, because, you know, now they have vernissage, finissage, midissage. So for the kind of middle of the Biennale this year, there was a panel also about national representation, and very interesting discussion. And one of the point was, should we have a sort of rotation? So should these, because this geopolitics of the Giardini is so outdated and is so a bit unfair, should we have imagined this crazy idea that maybe one year all the people that have all the countries that have a pavilion in the Giardini actually give it to another country that doesn't have a. So you know, there's a lot of ideas we can play also with this kind of representation of the world, or this microcosm that is the Giardini. And finally, the last thing I wanted to say is about this continuity, because you say so the thing with Portugal is because there is no fixed pavilion, there is no continuity, right? If I understand well, the site changes every year or almost every year. So there is not this idea that you know from the, like for example, I always refer to Canada because it's an example. I've come from Canada. I've been in the jury for that pavilion, so I know very well the reality. And the pavilion has a very specific. It was actually designed by BBPR, which is an Italian office, but it has a very, very specific shape and actually very difficult to work with. And this is something that comes again and again, year after year, with the people that have to do the Canadian pavilion. So, but at the same time, there's a very strong, I mean, the exhibition space has a strong impact on what is presented. And you don't have this. You don't have this kind of continuity with the Portuguese example. So, yeah, I think that's, but maybe the question I would like to throw for is this question of what the representation should be in terms of. Yeah.
Bom, eu acho que aqui.
Maybe we could talk about something that's also in this book by Delphine Sardo. If Portugal is interested in going to the Biennale, he says this ironically. If Portugal wants to go to the Eurovision, that song contest, but is it important to go to the Venice Biennale? And it is a national representation in a universal international forum, and it's important for Portugal to be there because Portugal in architecture has a lot of things to say. We are somewhat proud of our architecture in what we do and what we think of it. So it's interesting to be there, sure. According to what you both said, pertaining this exchange of national pavilions not belonging to a country, it might be given to other countries, an exchange that might be interesting. I don't think it will be easy, but maybe we could create an internal forum amongst us between, for example, Alexandra Areia says that it could be something debated between the Trienal de Arquitetura, the Bar of Architecture, Casa de Arquitetura. So, what Portugal wants to be in an international exhibition and doing this in a timely manner, because there is this issue that usually the Biennale of Architecture and Art is a very short period, 2 months for one thing, 2 months for that, 2 months to prepare, 2 months to assemble with almost no money. So it becomes difficult, you know. It ends up conditioning the goal and the result. So what we could do was to have an internal debate between different agents, universities, schools, or maybe, as you said, between in a pool of architects who can debate what the architectural representation of Portugal should be in the Biennale. That should be something that could happen regardless, not at the eve of the Biennale, but we could start tomorrow, right? In a timely manner. What is the intention? If we are to represent, what should we do? I think that this view of the competition in an open call to all of those who want to participate at the Biennale with a curatorship, I think that this is a democratic issue, so it's much more interesting that, well, nothing against deciding that this year the curator should be A or B. I don't care because, well, we are not that experienced in terms of competition, but what we have seen is that usually participations are more objective because the group is small, the thinking is driven, and things are more or less clear. No questions there. I don't know about the other participants at this year competition and what they have to bring to the table, but there is a debate that precedes all of this. After what I saw this year, which was a profusion of information, as someone said, architects becoming scientists, so much information, so much complexity, that we thought, what is the statement of Portugal? Where is the difference? Where are we making a difference? How can we this year or next year make a difference? What is the way to go? How will we do it? And we can even choose an international curator. I don't know. Opening the competition to other curators that have an outside look, like Catherine was saying, it might be interesting. Someone who looks at Portuguese architecture with different eyes and decides what's important to bring to Venice. I think that this would be worth it to debate it now, not 5 or 6 months before the Biennale starts. So I think it was worth it. And this goes to the set of people who are involved in this, and DG Art too. An anticipatory debate on what we will do in Venice and how will our investment be defined so that we can decide the type of call, the type of competition, how to do it. I might have an opinion, sure, but I don't know if this will happen between different architects, different institutions. Any model is possible. This would bring us closer to what you were saying about the election of the Dutch. Things work out better when they are discussed in advance. When you do it without time, things become very tricky. So if we could talk about it before, about what Venice represents, about what we want, about the presentation, about the selection, it might be interesting. Maybe there is no result coming from it, but maybe that's the way to go. I don't know. Well, at this exhibition we tried to show the array of possibilities. In fact, the emotion that we had of discovering a picture of the Pavilion of Alvarado with Portugal Arquitetura with an installation by Alberto Carneiro inside. I don't think I'm talking out of order, but we were all, at least I was, envious of the greatness. Having a pavilion, to borrow it, having a pavilion to be within the spirit of solidarity, a lesson of hospitality, if you will, that is an amazing way to have a representation. It's a wonderful way to be represented, choosing to be welcoming instead of just showing knickknacks. It's very important. I don't want to go any further. These examples always existed, and in this last one, of course, with COVID, there was an international perspective to it, a temporary international exhibition, if you will. But listening to DEPA, they got to understand that we can put things into perspective to see the big picture. We were all very worried if the money was enough for some corrections. And some colleagues of ours, curators, we were all talking and they were saying, well, we're at war. It won't work. We're at war. We have tourism. Now we don't have tourism. We're out of money. So not just the conflict that we debated, not just what he debated as the representation, but to quote Venturi, it seems almost well. There is a lot of world with worse problems than ours. Somewhat all of this, and we somewhat chose the logic of diplomacy. Diplomacy means being a part of something. It's not promotion. It's not saying that ours is better than others or that our problems are more difficult or more important. Solidarity, hospitality, participation, those are main values of democracy and culture. And studying this exhibition, there was a moment when we were to read the text of Aldo Rossi for the Biennale of '85, and he put together some competitions that are not necessary at all for places that are already built, and he says these are competitions for a square, a fortress, a road building, a bridge. It's figures of architectural thinking. And he says that these are competitions that are very, very specific. But because they are not necessary, we won't pay for it. So it's just architecture as a way of thinking, as a contribution for the collective building and intellectual of society. It's a very exciting, emotional text. And there were more than 1,000 entries. Everyone, students of the third year, famous architects, all of them competed for this because their participation was to participate in the collective building of the discipline of the subject, and they will be rewarded with a collective construction of knowledge, not with a fee. There was no return, no material reward. And this was properly explained, and it's quite exciting to see all of this. And I think that all of this is worth it. And if I remember correctly, the interview where Vittorio Gregotti says that information, construction, it's an interview with Léa, right? You interviewed Gregotti, right? Yes.
Se eu bem me lembro.
But if I remember correctly, you interviewed him, you interviewed Gregotti, and the question is, what is it for? What are things for? Then that, I think, is pivotal. And yes, everyone needs to know what things are for and to explain the goals. I think that's an amazing debate. That's why he said, well, from the point of view of the institution, what are the institutions? What are the role of institutions? That's why it was so interesting, the Biennale of São Paulo. It's important, the Biennale of São Paulo. The Portuguese state supports Biennale at São Paulo. It's very welcoming, and they do understand that the retribution of that support is attention. And clearly, well, but there is one thing that's very important, which is the state does not choose, for example. And that was the big debate in the 90s. When there is a Ministry of Culture for the first time, when the Ministry of Culture starts with the Biennale of Venice, there is an amazing decision of saying the state cannot choose. And because the state cannot choose, that doesn't mean that the state is an idiot. That's not it. The state says, no, we will choose a curator, we will choose someone who is close to the artist, and that accomplice of the artist will choose the rest. So we choose a curator, and then the curator chooses an artist in order to be effective and in order not to be a choice of the state.
Ways to be more productive with this biennale in general, and there is, I think, but this is a discussion for maybe beyond just the Portuguese representation, but I think there's definitely a way to reinvent things a little bit, and that we should definitely do it. And one thing, for example, in 76, like you show in the exhibition, there was this, Gregotti organized a big debate, and he put all the important, and Caesar was there, and he put all the important architects from, Europe and America, and had them have a discussion, like something that you would not see today, like because everybody is too busy doing this huge exhibition that no one has time to see, in fact, because it becomes also a very commercial logic of all the countries to try to put this quantity of exhibition. But I think there is a nice initiative that started this year, if I'm not wrong, or the edition before, which is, I think it's called the Curator Collective, which is a group of all the not all, but a large number of the national curator of all the countries that came together and decided to sort of self-organize. So it's not organized by the Biennale, it's really kind of self-organized, and they decided to try to create a discussion between all the countries to have some, and this is maybe where things could happen, things like swapping or hosting other countries, or having more discussion between these different national representation. And I think things are starting to move in that direction, and that this is a very nice initiative, and things like that. So I think we need to rethink also how these national representation work in general, and how they can work together maybe more, and have more synergy between the different nation, and also as you mentioned, because of course with COVID things change, and it's we understand that the quantity is maybe not anymore and also this whole commercial logic of bringing all this stuff to Venice and flying all these people, and that's also a bit absurd.
I don't know, maybe we can open this debate to the audience. We have a wonderful machine here that says time is up. But maybe what we could do now is to open this debate to the audience. We're not finished. The machine is saying we're finished. It's a different thing, okay? So maybe we can open this debate to our dear audience. Any questions? Any comments? Because none of us has solutions. That's a given. Hello. Good evening. Thank you for this debate. Always very interesting to talk about these things, especially given the experience of the exhibition. I've been following as a stakeholder. We always return to the Portuguese pavilion, of having a pavilion, not having a pavilion. And my question is, because I have my opinion, sure, I think that this experience of the exhibition clearly shows that there will be some opportunities, crisis and opportunity, right? Some opportunities of having this kind of nomad pavilion. By shoving the exhibition, it allows us to design a landscape of the city. And maybe if we were static, we couldn't. But I would ask you, there are some examples in Portugal of not having a pavilion following this logic of the Biennale. It's something that can be assessed in terms of participation that has been awarded. I'm thinking, for example, in Chile, they don't have a pavilion, but they have a quite remarkable representation. What are the lessons? What is the position? Having this as an opportunity and not necessarily as a problem. I think that one of the hypotheses, building a pavilion in Venice, a solid building, I think that will be very hard to accomplish. I'm not seeing it, honestly. Asking Caesar for a pavilion, well, it would be amazing because it would be one more international work by Caesar. But there might be other models. For example, an ephemeral building. Instead of a building, a plot of land. Why not having a plot of land where the Portuguese exhibition could happen? A building that would be temporary or a representation of a different nature. A square. Why must it be a building? It might be a square, a garden, where Portugal could somewhat, maybe in Giardini it will be difficult, but maybe around it. That would be a way of Venice to bring some public space so that could participate and bring something forward. What happens is that this rental of palaces, except for the exhibition that you were the commissary of, most of them are closed in those buildings. It's interesting to go around the city, sure, but the attractiveness for those, or either people are holding a map trying to see where Portugal is, or not a lot of people will go there, because what happened in Giudecca, although it was a strong representation because Caesar is an undeniable character of the world architecture, so there were a lot of visitors, but maybe not the ones that they would have if they were in a closer location to the center of the city or the city itself of what is. It doesn't have to be a building, because a permanent building, as Léa was saying, brings other worries, brings other difficulties. So the building then must be managed, and that adds difficulties. It's the case of Canada, which is not easy to manage. It might be an area that could, for example, work for Portugal to participate, or even they could, some other people, other countries, share it with other countries. For example, usually Chile, they have a representation that is connected with the assembly, with the construction of buildings, and this brings some visibility, sure. So I think that now, the way that the world is, and the way that the last representations are, I think that the debate is fully open, even in the city of Venice. How can we open the debate? Maybe this exhibition is an opportunity to have an extended debate, competition or not, right? I think we could have a debate about what we are looking for when we go abroad. What is our intention going to Dubai? What is our intention in international exhibitions? The universal exhibitions before were pivotal for each country to present what they had, to sell, to show their skill. But now, maybe the issues are different, the nature, the times. Does it make sense to have an universal exhibition? That's a question I ask myself. Going to Dubai, showing Portuguese literature, the discoveries. I don't know. Maybe we need to be more interventive and do things that are more intertwined with our practice in terms of our society and where we stand in the world. It's such a global thing that it's not just with Portugal can be. It has to do with Portugal can be within a set of participations that are much broader. Maybe we're not alone. I thought it was very interesting to have a pavilion for refugees this year, although the representation was quite modest. But I found it interesting to have a representation of people with no country, that they have no ground of their own. It's very important. It's very important to talk about this and how people live. Where will they live? This was something that called my attention. I don't know if we need to try to address things in a different manner. Things that bring attention, sure, but pursuing a goal that must be less, I don't know. It's not just showing the artist, showing the architect, but showing the context or what we should do from henceforth. How will the architecture transformed? Because architecture is continuously changing. If we're not careful, it might disappear or it will transform into something different. Architecture is something that welcomes, it hosts people, it gives home to people. And we're off. We don't have the screen anymore.
I think the idea of this ephemeral or temporary pavilion, I mean, first you need to find a plot in Venice, which is not easy, but I think the idea is interesting, and we know, of course, that whatever is ephemeral is always more impactful than, and you know, and then of course the Teatro del Mondo is the best example. At the same time, as you said, and I think it's, you know, does it make sense to build these ephemeral and create waste, and in a time where we know that, you know, we will build less and less, and we shouldn't. So I think this is an interesting question, but at the same time, and it's interesting because it would allow to do this construction information, I think that you were saying at the beginning. You know, it would allow the representation to be the content, but also the container, both. But of course, there are some ethical questions that go, and indeed the model of the international exhibition, the difference between Venice and this is that Venice's pavilion are permanent, while the idea, I mean, of course, there are examples that are staying, but the general idea of the international fair or the international exhibition is to create pavilions that are not lasting. But does it make sense in 2020 something to create an architecture that is ephemeral and will produce waste, or, you know, yeah. So I think those are questions to think about as well, probably.
Agora ia falar inglês. Podia ser uma coisa.
It might be something that's ephemeral, but then it could transit to somewhere else. It's not to create pollution or waste. No, it might follow a purpose afterwards. It might have a goal. Maybe it could be interesting thinking about it, but that would be a debate that we are. This is almost curatorship. We are almost. If I might add one thing, which is the historical perspective, national representations weren't always there. There is a specific biennale turning 30, the Biennale of 91, which had something that I think it's absolutely amazing, and other that I think it's not that amazing. And I have a fractured relationship with that Biennale. On the one hand, is the return of national pavilions, the return of the logic of national representation that didn't exist until 91, and it was recovered as an appropriation of the logic of the art biennale within the architecture of biennale by Francisco Dalcó. But it put together the Venice Award, which was a memory of something that was amazing, which was the courses of the 50s of Venice, which is a radically different thing. Venice is a place for communion, for invention. Those who are inventing and reinventing are youngsters, the youth. And it summoned 43 schools of architecture throughout the world. No African schools. No African schools. When we say the whole world, we clearly understand where the exclusions are. But in this rotational system, an invitation, a call, a place, and an amazing Babylon of 20-year-olds who are there for 1 month preparing a way of exchange, a way of thinking. There was a vast array of Pritzkers, of those who were there in 91. So the status quo was not always there. It came about and it will probably change. This debate must be about what we want. The Ezedra space, for example, in 06 was borrowed. Historically, if you'll allow me, apropos that floor that was borrowed and those who have no home, and because it's an architect who has an amazing relationship with Casa da Arquitetura, now that Casa da Arquitetura is turning 4, Marina Tavasso, she was in the first exhibition of Casa da Arquitetura. She was just awarded with a Johnson medal. Tuesday it will be the acceptance speech, and in the interview that Marina Tavasso grants to The Guardian, she says that she has been working to the Rohingya refugee community, which has the support of the government as long as they don't build with foundations. And Marina is using all her knowledge to build with light materials, local materials, which means in Portuguese cheap, inexpensive, but without a continuity, building a present that will not have future because the government doesn't want them there. That's the difference of having a ground, of having a floor, a present with a future or a present with just the present. This was just something that I think it's important, because Marina is part of this journey of bringing the architecture closer and closer to society, allowing us to think Marinette and Biennale of Venice. And this was just something that I think it was important to talk about. Of course, maybe the Biennale, maybe the Pavilion could have that magnificent logic of having no foundations.
The 91 exhibition, then it's really it's really about process more than results, right? So it's more about the fact that these students were there and met and then, you know, became later Pritzker, probably because it was, not because, but probably contributed, that it was such a rich experience. So that's another question. Should the Biennale be a process or should it be a result? You know, is it important what's happening there as a time, as a temporality, or is it really what we show that is important? Is it, you know, should it be a producer of something else? I think it's super interesting when the Biennale becomes like in the to come back to the 1980, because I have to, right? It was more, every architect produced a facade for the exhibition. So it wasn't representing something, or there were some exceptions that didn't play it by the rules, but technically they weren't supposed to show a building that they have built or they were gonna build. It was really about showing something new and producing something for the exhibition. So the exhibition really becomes a platform to enhance creation. And I think that's also what a Biennale should be, a space that is free of constraint. That's also where the ephemeral construction is interesting, because often the constraints are not the same, that's something that is there to last. So I think it should really allow a space to do something that you cannot do otherwise. Or it can be research. I mean, another thing when I talked about what the exhibition should it be productive or representation? Should it be research? I mean, you mentioned the Chilean, often, not always, but some of the, especially the one that won an award. I mean, the one that I can think of, they were really based they were research-based exhibitions. So that's also very interesting to use the platform of the Biennale to produce research about topics, I think. So, yeah. Should we wrap up?
Should we let these really nice people that came to hear us rest? I think it's probably...
It's almost bedtime, right?
Yes, wise and nice.
Obrigado.
Thank you. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Thank you.
Obrigado pela vossa presença. Lembramos que
Thank you for being here. Tomorrow it's the last day of celebrating the 4th anniversary of Casa da Arquitetura. Do join us. See you soon.
De Arquitetura. É um projeto que inclui comunidade local, vizinhos que residem à volta da Casa da Arquitetura. Tivemos vários encontros com estas 10 pessoas e recolhemos várias histórias, coisas muito curiosas, são gente muito gira e muito disponível. Juntamente com eles estamos com 3 bailarinas, uma francesa, uma italiana e uma portuguesa, que são 3 bailarinas, 3 intérpretes, e juntamente com mais 2 participantes da comunidade local surge o projeto Vizinhos, uma performance que vai ser apresentada na Casa da Arquitetura, no 4º aniversário, que junta a recolha destas histórias com movimento, com dança.
Da Casa da Arquitetura, 19 a 21 de novembro, em Matosinhos. Visitas orientadas e inclusivas às exposições, performances artísticas, apresentações e debates, atividades para crianças e famílias, entrada livre e viva a arquitetura.
Olá, o meu nome é Samuel Silva, estou aqui na Casa da Arquitetura, no âmbito das comemorações do seu 4º aniversário, a preparar a instalação Levitação. O projeto Levitação é uma instalação interdisciplinar que cruza várias disciplinas, desde logo a escultura, a luz, o som, a arquitetura. É uma instalação site-specific, que parte das especificidades da arquitetura para construir desenhos de luz, conjugadas com ambientes sonoros, preparados também eles especificamente pelos Arvon.
Todo o trabalho é feito quase a partir da luz, que levita no próprio espaço. Foi um trabalho desenvolvido com Samuel Silva e que andamos aqui quase a tentar suspender a luz e quase travá-la no espaço e no tempo.
Esta colaboração espontânea entre mim, enquanto artista plástico, e o Duarte Amorim é aqui motivo de exploração, experimentação, a partir e tomando como pretexto um poema do Daniel Faria, Explicação das Casas.
O meu nome é Sara Silva, sou coreógrafa da peça de Lugar Nenhum. Esta peça fala sobre a crise dos refugiados, que iniciou em 2015. Fizemos um levantamento sobre as vidas dessas pessoas. Tivemos a oportunidade de fazer uma entrevista a uma família de refugiados sírios e foi uma experiência única para os alunos e ajudou-nos também a entrar um bocadinho num universo que não é o nosso. Fizemos também um levantamento de vídeos e histórias da plataforma dos refugiados, que foi muito útil para gerarmos um movimento e também para criarmos uma dramaturgia da nossa história. Nesta peça do Lugar Nenhum vamos ter os bailarinos da Companhia Dança de Matosinhos, também com os alunos da Academia Dança de Matosinhos e integrando a peça cenográfica de Morada Vaga.
Houve uma parte da Real Vinícola em que existia um caminho de ferro que transportava o vinho para as caves, etc. Desde o início, esse elemento móvel fazia sentido para nós conectá-lo à temática da viagem dos migrantes. E então essa ideia do comboio, de alguma forma, está plasmada também aqui na peça, o facto de ser um objeto móvel. Isto simbolizar um pouco a proa de um barco, no fundo também estabelece algumas relações com o barco que esteve encalhado aqui ao largo do Castelo do Queijo durante muitos anos.
Olá, eu chamo-me António, sou co-diretor artístico da Companhia Radar 360 Graus. Estamos aqui na Casa da Arquitetura a preparar o 4º aniversário com a performance Ponto Traço. É uma performance deambulatória que se propõe a percorrer o espaço exterior e o espaço semi-exterior, semi-interior da Casa da Arquitetura, onde de algum modo vamos ao encontro dessas memórias para conseguirmos interpretar esta pré-existência do passado e também para nos ajudar a imaginar e a construir aquilo que é o presente e o que será o futuro.
O meu nome é Filipa Godinho, trabalho no Serviço Educativo da Casa da Arquitetura. Este fim de semana celebramos o 4º aniversário. Este é um programa totalmente gratuito, dirigido a todos os tipos de públicos, desde crianças, com oficinas para pequeninos, até adultos e mesmo atividades inclusivas. No que diz respeito às visitas orientadas, elas acontecem na Casa da Arquitetura, no arquivo da Casa da Arquitetura. Acompanham também as exposições patentes, a que está na nave, que é a Radar Veneza, e a que está na galeria, What, When, Why Not, e são orientadas por especialistas ligados sempre às exposições patentes, ora curadores como convidados. As visitas inclusivas dirigem-se a pessoas com dificuldades variadas, desde pessoas com dificuldades auditivas como visuais, daí a tradução para a língua gestual portuguesa e com audiodescrição. A nossa vontade é mesmo de acolher todos os públicos. Uma vez que estamos a celebrar o 4º aniversário da Casa da Arquitetura, a oficina que o Serviço Educativo propõe parte da ideia de uma casa. As crianças vão construir uma casa que é uma casa diferente, porque é muito musical, daí o tema da oficina do Vento Sem Fim, e fica o desafio para as crianças acompanhadas pelas famílias para virem desenvolver esta atividade. As exposições têm entrada livre e gratuita, com visitas pop-up que acontecem espontaneamente perante qualquer visitante que esteja connosco, por isso a informação é mesmo aberta para o público durante todo o fim de semana.
Hi, I'm Willy Dorner. I'm here to prepare our project Bodies in Urban Spaces in Matosinhos. Project Bodies in Urban Spaces started actually as a photo project indoor, and very quickly over the years I decided to take the project out, and it turned out that it is a really nice walk for residents to see their surroundings, to see their neighborhood again. With the help of the bodies, I design, I interpret architecture, and I help them to read or reread their neighborhood that they know so well in a different way and in a new way. And I hope that people come and take the time to watch and to see their neighborhood again under different circumstances.
O meu nome devia ser Luís Ferreira Alves, mas não, a minha mãe bateu o pé, não, então tem que ter o meu nome. E eu fiquei Luís Seixas Ferreira Alves. O meu pai era banqueiro, o meu avô era banqueiro, o meu bisavô era banqueiro, eu sou fotógrafo.
Quer dizer, o Luís começou com fotografia de catálogo para a meia casa e depois aquilo consumia muito ao fim de semana, até que ele transformava, ele até alugou outro apartamento para fazer de estúdio outro apartamento e passava os fins de semana e noites a fotografar produto. Sim, o primeiro trabalho de arquitetura foi com o Pedro Ramalho. Não foi final de curso, uma tese.
Tendo a apresentar um trabalho. Basicamente era um portfólio de obras que já tinha feito.
Ele fez um diaporama com slide e foi um sucesso. E depois, como estavam todos os arquitetos a ver aquilo, começaram logo a pedir, encomendar trabalho de arquitetura. E depois ele tinha tanto trabalho de fotografia que acabou por abandonar a Fotobol e dedicar-se 100% à fotografia. Porque ele era amigo de Alves Costa, do Pedro Ramalho, portanto abrangeu os mestres, digamos, do Norte. Depois o Cisa, o Fernando Távora, todos os grandes arquitetos do Norte fotografaram com o Luís. Todos.
Eu conheci o Luís por intermédio do Pedro, que foi o anterior assistente. A entrevista foi ver uma curta-metragem do Vitor Eris. A sério, eu cheguei à casa do Luís. A primeira pergunta foi: queres trabalhar com um velhinho? A partir daí comecei a aprender imenso. Ao ver a obra, andar à volta da obra, ele usa muito a expressão de descascar a laranja.
Exato, descascar.
Pronto. E foi isso é isso que ele faz. Ou seja, contextualizar a obra e depois começar a gerá-la e vai ao pormenor.
Bom, eu conheci o Ferreira Alves porque, ao trabalhar no escritório do Cisa, o Cisa é arquiteto, faz obras, e geralmente pedia ao Ferreira Alves para tirar fotografias. E quando eu realizei a minha primeira obra, Casa das Artes, a obra construiu-se, é evidente que fui falar com o Ferreira Alves, que era chamado o fotógrafo da arquitetura, não havia muita escolha, não se pode dizer, eu gostava muito dele, prefiro ele ou não, era o fotógrafo. À medida que as obras iam evoluindo desde 80 até 2020, estamos com 40 anos. Eu, gradualmente comecei a achar que eu quase que percebia as minhas intenções da arquitetura, ou habituou-se a um determinado olhar sobre as minhas coisas. Eu até pus em causa se eu fazia a arquitetura ao fazer os croquis, era como se fizesse a fotografia que ele ia fazer. Bom, portanto, é um homem que não é normal encontrar, quase completo. Amigo, ótimo profissional, um passado riquíssimo. Esteticamente, o que produzia era irrefutável, num rigor quase absoluto. Valores estéticos e valores éticos, não é fácil. E uma vez apresentamos um livro que ele fez, eu falei, e o Nuno Brandão Corte fez a apresentação e fez uma citação que eu gostei imenso, que disse assim como o arquiteto Papa diz, uma vez disse, eu sou a arquitetura portuguesa, o farol é a fotografia portuguesa.
Estamos na Faculdade de Arquitetura da Universidade do Porto, no pavilhão Carlos Ramos. Carlos Ramos foi